Childhood neglect and love often starts with a detail people overlook. Picture the situation where childhood neglect teaches the nervous system what to expect from closeness. A child whose needs were ignored may grow into an adult who expects emotional absence. Early care becomes a template for later trust. The moment becomes easier to handle when the moving part is named clearly in how childhood neglect affects love. The safer move in how childhood neglect affects love is to test the facts before acting on the first impression. Childhood neglect and love becomes clearer in a concrete situation. The clearest version is when neglect is not always dramatic. A home may provide food and school while rarely offering comfort or attention. Emotional needs can be missed without visible crisis. That mechanism explains why the topic affects real choices in how childhood neglect affects love. In this situation, emotional needs can be missed without visible crisis is the part that usually creates the real consequence. Childhood neglect and love changes the decision before anyone names it. In how childhood neglect affects love, someone may notice that people may learn to need less. A child stops asking because asking did not work. Independence becomes protection rather than preference. Seeing the cause early gives people more room to respond well in how childhood neglect affects love. A careful response starts by noticing how people may learn to need less. Connects to independence becomes protection rather than preference. Childhood neglect and love has a cost that appears later. Watch what happens when receiving love can feel unfamiliar. A partner's warmth may create suspicion instead of ease. The body is not used to consistent attention. In how childhood neglect affects love, the visible event can distract from the driver that needs attention. That is the point where how childhood neglect affects love becomes a real decision rather than an abstract idea. Childhood neglect and love depends on timing as much as facts. How childhood neglect affects love becomes concrete when neglect can create overgiving. Someone becomes useful, agreeable, or rescuing to earn closeness. Care is treated as something to secure through performance. When how childhood neglect affects love appears in real life, this is the detail to check first. The safer move in how childhood neglect affects love is to test the facts before acting on the first impression. Childhood neglect and love can look simple from outside. For example, others become emotionally distant. A person avoids vulnerability because no one responded before. Self-protection looks like independence. In how childhood neglect affects love, this is the point where the visible choice and the real pressure start to meet. In this situation, self-protection looks like independence is the part that usually creates the real consequence. Childhood neglect and love creates pressure in ordinary life. In real life, attention can feel like pressure. Someone who grew up unseen may want closeness but panic when truly noticed. Being visible was never practiced safely. That is why how childhood neglect affects love should be read through facts rather than a quick assumption. A careful response starts by noticing how attention can feel like pressure. Connects to being visible was never practiced safely. Childhood neglect and love is shaped by rules and incentives. Think about how conflict may feel like abandonment. A normal disagreement can trigger the old expectation that care will disappear. The body reacts to loss before the mind reviews facts. For how childhood neglect affects love, the important move is to notice the chain from first signal to final effect. That is the point where how childhood neglect affects love becomes a real decision rather than an abstract idea. Childhood neglect and love becomes risky when assumptions replace evidence. A simple how childhood neglect affects love case is this. Neglect affects communication. People may struggle to name needs because needs were never welcomed. Language for desire, hurt, and comfort may be underdeveloped. That sequence explains why how childhood neglect affects love can grow even when the first moment looks small. The safer move in how childhood neglect affects love is to test the facts before acting on the first impression. Childhood neglect and love is easier to handle when the moving parts are visible. How childhood neglect affects love appears when self-worth can become conditional. Someone believes they must be low maintenance to be loved. The old lesson says needs are burdens. The early sign matters in how childhood neglect affects love because it can change cost, trust, timing, or emotional meaning. In this situation, the old lesson says needs are burdens is the part that usually creates the real consequence. Childhood neglect and love has both a visible side and a quieter side. One ordinary how childhood neglect affects love version is that choosing unavailable partners can feel familiar. Emotional distance may match the childhood atmosphere. Familiarity can be mistaken for chemistry. The pattern in how childhood neglect affects love is easier to handle when the first signal is noticed instead of dismissed. A careful response starts by noticing how choosing unavailable partners can feel familiar connects to familiarity can be mistaken for chemistry. Childhood neglect and love can turn small choices into larger consequences. Consider the moment when secure partners may feel boring at first. Steady care lacks the dramatic tension of chasing attention. Calm can be misread as lack of passion. The answer in how childhood neglect affects love is usually found in the cause, not in the label people attach afterward. That is the point where how childhood neglect affects love becomes a real decision rather than an abstract idea. Childhood neglect and love rewards preparation more than guessing. How childhood neglect affects love becomes clearer when neglect can increase sensitivity to small signs. A delayed reply or distracted tone may feel deeply painful. Old deprivation makes cues of absence louder. Once the cause is named in how childhood neglect affects love, the response can fit the situation more closely. The safer move in how childhood neglect affects love is to test the facts before acting on the first impression. Childhood neglect and love can be misunderstood when people focus on one number. In how childhood neglect affects love, notice when repair needs patience. One caring conversation cannot erase years of emotional scarcity. Trust grows through repeated moments of availability. The link between those pieces is what makes how childhood neglect affects love useful in real life. In this situation, trust grows through repeated moments of availability is the part that usually creates the real consequence. Childhood neglect and love affects trust because expectations are involved. A familiar how childhood neglect affects love example is when boundaries are part of healing. A neglected person may tolerate too little or demand too much because needs feel frightening. Clear limits make closeness safer. People often feel pressure around how childhood neglect affects love before they can explain where it came from. A careful response starts by noticing how boundaries are part of healing connects to clear limits make closeness safer. Childhood neglect and love works differently for different people. In how childhood neglect affects love, the real-world version may be that the neglected child may still be active inside adult love. A partner's kindness can touch grief for what was missing. Sadness may appear alongside gratitude. This is the detail that changes what to check next in how childhood neglect affects love. That is the point where how childhood neglect affects love becomes a real decision rather than an abstract idea. Childhood neglect and love should be checked before money or emotion is committed. It shows up in small moments, such as when naming needs as a skill. Asking for reassurance, time, or affection may feel awkward at first. Practice turns hidden longing into communication. Noticing that driver early can keep how childhood neglect affects love from becoming harder to manage. The safer move in how childhood neglect affects love is to test the facts before acting on the first impression. Childhood neglect and love becomes easier to manage when records are clear. Look at a case where self-care is not a replacement for love. Learning to comfort oneself helps but does not mean needing no one. Healthy connection includes mutual care. The headline alone does not show the whole chain behind how childhood neglect affects love. In this situation, healthy connection includes mutual care as the part that usually creates the real consequence. Childhood neglect and love requires a specific next step rather than a vague hope. A concrete version is when professional support can help when patterns feel stuck. Therapy or structured support can separate past neglect from present relationships. The work is not blaming parents forever. The background force should guide the next decision in how childhood neglect affects love more than the first reaction. A careful response starts by noticing how professional support can help when patterns feel stuck. Connects to the work is not blaming parents forever. Childhood neglect and love matters because the result is felt in daily life. In a normal day, childhood neglect affects love by shaping what closeness feels like. It can make care feel unsafe, needs feel shameful, and distance feel normal. Healing begins when consistent love is allowed to become familiar instead of suspicious. In how childhood neglect affects love, the clearer reading follows the cause instead of stopping at the visible result. That is the point where how childhood neglect affects love becomes a real decision rather than an abstract idea.